Okay. So I just want to say good evening and welcome. This is our second in our Fall into OBOB 2025 event series. I'm Julie. I'm the event manager at Roundabout Books in Bend. Um, if you're joining us tonight for the first time, we'd love to hear where you're from. You can put that in the chat. And then just a reminder that the event is being recorded. So if you don't want your kids' faces shown, we completely understand. And we'll be sending out the YouTube link later so you can rewatch it, share it with your friends who couldn't make it tonight. We're just really excited to share the love of reading with you through OBOB and these wonderful authors who have volunteered their time to talk with you about their books. As a reminder, tonight we're talking about Finding Langston, which is so cool. So, this book is not only a Coretta Scott King author honor book, but it's the winner of the Scott Odell Award for Historical Fiction. And what I find really interesting about this is we're introducing a very important person in the American lexicon to new readers. So if you're not familiar with Langston Hughes and everything he did, this is a great way to start that. So, just a quick little intro about the book. When 11-year-old Langston's father moves them from their home in Alabama to Chicago's Bronzeville district, it feels like he's giving up everything he loves. It's 1946. Langston's mother has just died, and now they're leaving the rest of his family and friends. He misses everything: Grandma's Sunday suppers, the red dirt roads, and the magnolia trees his mother loved. In the city, they live in a small apartment surrounded by noise and chaos. It doesn't feel like a new start or a better life. At home, he's lonely, his father always busy at work. At school, he's bullied for being a country boy. But Langston's new home has one fantastic thing. Unlike the whites only library in Alabama, the Chicago Public Library welcomes everyone. There, hiding out after school, Langston discovers another Langston, a poet whom he learns inspired his mother enough to name her only son after him. Lesa Cline-Ransome, author of Before She Was Harriet, has crafted a lyrical debut novel about one boy's experience during the Great Migration. This book includes an author's note about the historical context and her research. So please, everyone, welcome Lesa Cline-Ransome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's such a treat to be with you all. I was mentioning that I spent some time this summer in Oregon in Eugene. I'm a huge track and field um, fan, and so I went to the championships, and it was wonderful. So we'll
Awesome.
dive right in.
Okay.
Julie is
Yeah, I
managing the
will get
slide.
this.
Good luck.
I got it. There we go.
Right. Okay, so you may be familiar with some of these titles. I've written about 30 books to date, 25 of them picture books. So Finding Langston was my very first middle grade novel. And I'm going to start from the top about my early beginnings. Next slide.
Yep. Gotcha. Oh, come on, computer. Why is it not doing it? There we go.
Okay, and you can even click the next one. I was born in the next one too, and I was born in Malden, Massachusetts. I'm the youngest of three. I grew up there with my parents. Next slide. Who are both my parents were nurses, and I have an older brother and sister, Billy and Linda. Okay. What I loved about my parents, in addition to them being incredibly warm, kind, generous people, was that they also had their own passions, and those passions were instilled in me. My father was a huge, huge music lover, music fan. He loved jazz, and we often listened to jazz in the house. He put speakers in every room so that we could always hear his music. Next slide. And my mom loved to read. And so she worked the night shift, but during the day, she would come home and she would spend her days reading. And every single weekend, she took me here to the Malden Public Library. And this is where I began to fall in love with books and stories and words. And I want you to pay very close attention to the picture of this library because we'll be discussing it later. Next slide. I grew up as a girl who was incredibly scared and nervous and anxious about everything. But the one thing that really made me feel at home were books and the library. This was my second home, much like Langston. I grew up reading Pippi Longstocking, anything by Judy Blume, and my favorite of all time was The Diary of Anne Frank, in part because my mom gave me a diary when I was 10. But I wasn't sure how I could become a writer. And so I had another passion at the time, which was marketing or fashion merchandising. And so I went to art school at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. And while there, I discovered a couple of really interesting things that changed my entire life. One, I discovered that I didn't want to be a buyer at a department store. I wanted to be a writer. And so I wound up taking all the writing courses they offered, and I wound up becoming a copywriter at a couple of ad agencies. Another interesting thing that happened was that I met um, another student there named James Ransom, who was an illustration major. We both attended a Prince Purple Rain party, all Prince music, all Purple Rain. If you don't know Prince, you should. So we met there and we began dating and we fell in love. Then, a couple of years after we graduated college, we got married. So I have been married now for 36 years. And James happens to be the illustrator of many of my books, at least 15 of my books. He's illustrated 80 of his own, but he loves illustrating my books. So we live in what's called the Hudson Valley region of New York. It's about an hour and a half from New York City, north of New York City, and an hour and a half south from the capital of New York, which is Albany. So, but we live in a very quiet, rural kind of a town in the it's called the Hudson Valley region of New York. We're surrounded by mountains. And in that home, James and I work, but we've also raised our family. I'll introduce you to our four lovely children. There's Jamie on the end with the blue glasses. Jamie is 31 and she works as a curator. Then the next is Maya with the blue dress on. Maya is 30 and she works at a cosmetics company in New York City. She's a design director. Malcolm is 29, and Malcolm works in New York City as an industrial designer. And then the youngest is Layla, and Layla is 25 years old. And Layla works at a charter school, working with curriculum and testing for students. So I mentioned that this is the home where I work. So I work at home in my office. And James and I, even though we collaborate often together on picture books, we do not work in the same space. So this is my office here. You'll see my desk where I'm at right now. And I have areas where I store lots of books and projects as I'm working. And as a writer, I think it's impossible to be a writer without first being a reader. And so in my office is lined with bookshelves, and this is where I spend a lot of my time reading and researching. And this is a project area where I keep my printer. I keep lots of my research, which is a crucial part of any book that I'm writing. Okay. And here you'll see some examples of books that I've used for different projects. A lot of the books here were centered on the West when I wrote my book, One Big Open Sky. And another bookshelf, and sometimes I have a visitor, which is my daughter's cat, Willow. And I had to show you Willow because Willow's super cute. There's another slide. The next slide shows you a close-up picture of Willow, just in case you couldn't see him in that bookshelf. Super cute. James works all the way across the house in his own studio. I'm just showing you a picture here. And this is where he has his own a huge studio so he can do his paintings and illustrations. But we work on opposite sides of the house, in part because I like a nice quiet space and he likes a loud space. Now, here I am in sixth grade. We've gone from me in kindergarten to me in sixth grade. And as a young girl, it's interesting that I write books that often center in history because as a young girl, the subject I liked the least after math was history. I instead loved English class. I loved writing stories. I loved spelling tests. And here is one of my spelling tests from sixth grade, I think. Yeah, sixth grade. And so I loved writing words since I was a very young child. But I started learning more about history as I got older and reading about all these incredible individuals that I wanted to write about. And these are some of their names: John Lewis and Paul Cuffey and Langston Hughes, Frederick Douglass, Shirley Chisholm. These are some of the incredible people who've made contributions to our shared history. And I think their stories haven't been told enough. I certainly didn't know them as a child. So I feel like I'm really learning a lot and sharing a lot now, writing their stories. These are some of the books in which those same people have been featured in my picture books. And what I love most about being a writer is that I get to write about things I feel really passionate about. I mentioned I was in Eugene because I love track and field. I love basically all sports. And so I've written about sports figure Satchel Paige and the tennis star sisters and young Pele. I've also written about hidden histories like the Overground Railroad, which is part of the Great Migration. And another migration story is One Big Open Sky, which is the story of Black pioneers traveling in 1879. I grew up in a household filled with music because of my dad, and so I love writing now about jazz musicians. I've written about Louis Armstrong and the story of the saxophone and Benny Goodman and Teddy Wilson. And I also love writing about people who center their lives on community and activism, like John Lewis in Fighting with Love, and the groundbreaking journalist who was a White House correspondent named Ethel Payne for the book The Power of Her Pen. I love writing about strong girls and women because these were the books that I read. I read books about strong, adventurous women. And so I love now writing the stories of women like Claudette Colvin, who was an activist. Before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin, who refused to give up her seat on a bus, which helped to launch the civil rights movement. The story of Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician, and of course, my all-time favorite, Harriet Tubman, and Before She Was Harriet. But I've also discovered these incredible stories from the Great Migration. So Overground Railroad, which tracks the story of a very young girl leaving the South with her family aboard a train. So instead of the Underground Railroad, which we know is a secret passage or system to help people from the South escape north, the Overground Railroad was people who rode on a train to head north during the Great Migration. So the Finding Langston series kind of began, so there are three books in this series. It began with my reading. I mentioned it's hard to be a writer without first being a reader, but I read this incredible book called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's a story, it's an adult book. It's the epic story of America's Great Migration, and it is written by the author Isabel Wilkerson. And I will tell you that I never knew much about the Great Migration. Well, I just didn't know that it was called the Great Migration. This is the story of 7 million people who left the South between 1917 and 1970. You can go to the next slide. And they traveled to all different parts of the country. They traveled west to California and Oregon, and they traveled north up to Boston and Philadelphia, and west and north and Midwest in Chicago and Detroit and Milwaukee. Next slide. And they've traveled by car, some walked, some took the train. And so they found all types of ways to get here. And what I loved about this story is I'm always looking for a personal connection. And so this is also the story of my own parents. My mother left Charlottesville, Virginia, when she was 5 years old and traveled north to Everett, Massachusetts. And my father left Shelby, North Carolina, and traveled north to Providence, Rhode Island when he was 12 years old. And so, because I have these stories in my family, I thought it would be a great idea to imagine this story through the eyes of the Great Migration, through the eyes of a young child. Next slide. And when I had to do that, I thought of my son, Malcolm, who at 10 years old was a kid who was so unbelievably sensitive. He would cry all the time. He loved to hold my hand. He loved to go to the library with me and read books. And he was such a sweet, sensitive boy. I tried to imagine what would the Great Migration have been like for Malcolm to leave everything he knew behind and everyone he knew and travel north to a town he never heard of and never knew and knew no one. How would he have managed? And that's how I started thinking about this book. Each of the stories that I write begin with research. I usually start at my local library here in town. Next slide. And I take out as many books as I can on a subject. When I was writing about the Negro League baseball player Satchel Paige, I took out every book they had about baseball players and the sport of baseball. I did the same thing when I began working on Finding Langston. This time I read newspapers like the Chicago Defender. And I also traveled to Chicago and I traveled to Alabama. And I spoke with librarians and I just began gathering up all types of research to help me understand what Langston was leaving and what he was going to. And I imagined that this might be his house in Alabama. And he came to Chicago where the houses looked like this, they were all stacked on top of each other. People lived on top of each other. And that huge difference between where he left and where he came to is what I decided to focus on. I also looked at a lot of photographs about kitchenette apartments, which is where Langston winds up living with his father after the death of his mother. And so this is an example of a photo that I might have looked at for a kitchenette apartment. And I did a lot of research on writers from that time period, like Zora Neale Hurston and Gwendolyn Brooks. I learned about a man named George Cleveland Hall, who was a physician in Chicago in the 1940s. When he died, they named a library after him, the George Cleveland Hall Branch Library, which is where Langston visits. And I learned about one of the first Black librarians in Chicago named Vivian Harsh. And because of her, she would bring in all types of authors from the area in to do lecture series, which was very unusual at the time. And of course, I began reading the poetry of Langston Hughes. And the story of Langston didn't begin with him as named Langston. His name was Grant, the son of middle name of my son, Malcolm. But after reading all these works by Langston Hughes, I realized there's a really close parallel between the life that Langston Hughes lived in the South and in the West, and then coming north and feeling so lonely and missing his mother so deeply. So I decided to tie those two stories together, the story of a lonely young Langston and the story of Langston Hughes. Now, then I found the picture of this library that was built in Langston's neighborhood, the George Cleveland Hall Branch Library. And it reminded me so much of the library that I used to go to all the time as a child. And so when I'm describing in the book how the children's room looks downstairs, I'm actually describing my own library, the one I went to every Saturday with my mom. Whenever I'm doing research, I take tons and tons of notes. I always have a notebook with me. I keep one here. I have stacks of notebooks where I keep all of my research and I try to organize it. I usually divide it up into different categories, quotes, and young life and geographic regions. I divide them into categories. I put them on little note cards so that I can, whenever I need to grab something quickly, I have them all organized. And then I begin writing kind of a rough draft. I usually write it out longhand, and I just start sketching out the idea of how I think I'm going to tell the story. And then I sit at my desk and I start typing up what's called the manuscript. It's really just the typed version of my story. When I was doing research for this book, you'll see here a folder called Finding Home. That was the original title of the book, Finding Home, because it's about a boy who finds his home in a library. And you see all this research that I gathered, all the articles I printed out about Chicago and about writers and musicians, everything I crammed here into this folder. And then I sent the book out to different editors and I waited for them to love the story as much as I did. But I got rejection after rejection after rejection. But an editor said to me, what about if you made it into a middle grade novel? So that's what I did. So I went back and I started thinking about ways, different ideas I could come up with. And I began asking myself lots of questions, like, um, what was Langston's experience of his mother's death? And how did he feel? And what was Langston's life in Alabama before and after his mother died? So by asking these questions and answering them, I came up with a bigger story of Langston. And that's how it turned from a picture book into a middle grade novel. And I wanted to show you, I mentioned that sometimes, part of the process of writing is doing revisions. And so when I started this book, I would send it into my editor and we would do 4 or 5 sets of revisions. She would send it back to me with lots of questions and corrections. The illustrator often does the same thing. So this jacket on the left is what the illustrator, my husband, that was his original Finding Langston cover. But then he realized he didn't like the cover and he thought he could do a better cover. So he revised it. So now you have the cover that you see is the new cover. But that was the first cover. And I also thought I would share with you that a publishing company in Japan bought the rights to Finding Langston. And this is the Japanese version of Finding Langston, which is very different. And I wasn't sure if we'd have time to read. It's 8:21. Should I just take questions or do I have time to read a little bit?
Do you want me to exit out of the screen sharing or keep it up?
Yes. You can,
Okay.
well, you can keep this up. Keep it up.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, go
I'll
ahead.
just read just a few minutes. I'll just read a
Okay.
little bit. And this is when Langston is visiting the library for the second time. Remember, he's wasn't familiar with libraries, but he goes into the library and he's completely unfamiliar with everything that's happening. Downstairs, I see kids my age, some younger ones too, with their mothers, sitting at smaller tables looking through books. When we get downstairs, she says, my name is Mrs. Kimball. I am the adult librarian, but Miss Cook at the desk will help you with your selections. Her voice is so crisp and clear, she makes every word sound special. Miss Cook is the children's librarian. Librarian selections. I don't know what any of those words mean, but I aim to find out. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Kimball, she says. Thank you, Mrs. Kimball, I say, happy when she turns to go back upstairs. I go back to the shelf and back to the book with the words from my heart. I take it from the shelf, looking around to make sure it's okay. I sit at one of the empty tables close to the window and open the book. I'm going to write me some music about daybreak in Alabama. And I'm going to put the prettiest songs in it, rising out of the ground like a swamp mist and falling out of heaven like soft dew. I'm going to put some tall, tall trees in it, and the scent of pine needles, and the smell of red clay after rain. I have to stop. I can feel the choking in my throat that always starts before the tears. I look to make sure no one's watching, but everyone's looking at their own books. Miss Cook is at her desk busy sorting through cards. I stand so fast I knock over my chair. Miss Cook looks up. Would you like to check that out? She asks. Check out. More words I'll need to learn. Ma'am, I say. She waves me over. I stand in front of her at the desk, and she tells me I can borrow any book I want with a library card. But first, she needs my name and address. A place where you could borrow books, I remember Mama telling me. Before I give her my address, I ask, are you a librarian? Yes, I am, she answers with a smile. A librarian is someone who lets you borrow books in a library. One word down, I think. 4501 Wabash. She writes that down. And your name? Langston, I tell her. Hey,
That was fantastic.
thank you.
All right.
Hey. So I think I saw one hand. Oh, you could stop. These are the this is the sequel to Finding Langston. It's a story of leaving Lyman and being Clem.
Perfect. Yeah, it looks like we are ready for questions. And you were with us last night. I'm going to say your name. Was it Daya?
Dia.
Dia. I'm gonna write it down.
Hi,
Um,
Dia.
Thank you.
yeah, why did you decided to make it Finding Langston instead of Finding Home?
So I was sure Finding Home was a great title. And then one day, my editor called me and she said, he also found Langston. And by finding Langston, he found home. Maybe we should call it Finding Langston. And then people will also know that it's possibly about Langston Hughes. People often see this book and think it's a book about Langston Hughes, and it is in small part. But we both thought that the title spoke more to his discovery of Langston himself and Langston the poet.
Great question. Thank you. If you have a question that you want to ask out loud, you can also use the raised hand function in Zoom, or you can put it in the chat window. And this is a question we get almost every single time, but was it fun to write this book?
It was incredibly fun, but I will have to tell you that it was also incredibly scary. I mentioned that I had only written picture books. I felt like I'm not sure how to write a novel. And so I learned a lot, which to me is incredibly fun. And I learned a lot about myself as a writer and what I can do. So I would say it was very fun, but at the same time, very, very scary.
We often get questions too about how long it took you to write the book because it feels like it's hard to quantify if you've been working on it, in your head for a little bit, or like you said, you started with a picture book. So once you chose to kind of change it to middle grade, how long did it take you?
The research always takes me much longer than the actual writing because I feel like unless I have the research and unless I really understand where the characters are from and what they ate and how they lived their lives and what was happening in the world around them, it would be hard for me to write their story. So I spend usually about 4 to 6 months researching and then 2 to 3 months writing if it's a middle grade novel, a little longer if it's a young adult novel.
Yeah. Um, so maybe talk to us just a little bit too about Langston Hughes, the inspiration for this, because I think maybe a lot of kids now don't know what he did for poetry as an activist, part of the Harlem Renaissance. Like, who was Langston Hughes to you?
What I love about Langston Hughes' work is that it's so accessible. He didn't necessarily write for children, but everybody of any age could read his poetry and understand it and identify with it. A lot of times people, I think poetry makes them afraid because they find it very intimidating and they're not really understanding it and the language is super flowery. But with Langston Hughes, he used this kind of a plain spoken way of talking about what it was like to be a Black person living in America, what it was like to be a man, what it was like to be afraid, what it was like to be missing home, what it was like to love Alabama and the tall, tall trees and what it was like to love jazz and blues. And so he's talking about his loves and his life, and it just you understand him, you understand what he's talking about, what he's feeling. And so I think that Langston Hughes was a perfect poet to use to have Langston meet or come to in the book.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. It looks like we had a hand raised from Misha. Did you still want to ask your question? Okay, go ahead and unmute.
How long have I been writing books? I want to be sure I have the whole question. I started writing books when my oldest was just born. So it's been 31 years since I've
Wow,
started writing books, a long time. And in 31 years, I've written 30 something books.
that's impressive. All right. All right, Misha, go ahead and ask your question. You're still muted.
It was the same question.
Oh, okay. So yeah, somebody had the same idea you did. That's awesome. Um, what other inspirations do you have? Like, have you thought about writing? Well, you've written about a lot of, kind of done biographies of people. Who are some other um, people from kind of maybe like the Harlem Renaissance or the Great Migration that you've always wanted to learn more about?
I definitely would love to write a story around Zora Neale Hurston. I find her story to be really, really fascinating. She sacrificed everything to be a writer and often lived in such extreme poverty. Like she would go days without eating. She didn't care. All she owned was a typewriter. I think she had one dress and she spent a lot of her life just writing stories. That's how important writing and the craft of writing and the art of writing was to her.
Yeah,
I will just tell you that one other aside, as I mentioned the book One Big Open Sky, and I had written these three books that were based in the Great Migration. And then I read an article that told me that that was not the first Great Migration, that the first Great Migration took place in 1879 when Blacks left the South and began moving west. Now, I grew up reading a lot of Little House on the Prairie stories and pioneer stories, but I had never known that they were Black pioneers. And so my book, One Big Open Sky, was about another Great Migration, which I find so fascinating that the more you dig, the more you find out about history and the truth of history.
absolutely. I'm wondering if our kiddos that are here tonight, what would you think if, and you can put this in the chat, if you suddenly had to move from the
Mm.
house that you've known forever to a city you'd never been to and like, didn't know anything about. I moved to Portland, which I'd been to a lot of times, but it was my first time living alone. And so I just remember those first nights where there was more sound than I was used to. But on the flip side, when I moved back to Bend, it was almost too quiet. And so you do get used to your surroundings. I'm seeing depressing, nervous, scared.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's so important for us to think about a kid around your same age moving for very scary and just big reasons, right? Like that a parent passed away. That's a big reason to have to move. Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Do we have another question, Misha? Looks like you have your hand up.
There was also a question
Oh,
in the chat about how many times I rewrite
mhm.
a book.
Yeah.
And so it depends because I have rewritten books five, six times. I'm not usually rewriting the entire book, but I'm rewriting portions of it. Or I'm adding more, or sometimes I write too much and I have to take a lot away. So usually though, about five or six times, I will make all the changes and I'll send it back to my editor, and then she makes more notes and sends it back to me. So like that could go five or six times.
Uh, all right. One
Okay.
of the things that oh, Misha, did you still have a question? Okay, go ahead and unmute.
Why do you write history stories? Like, what do you write history stories?
Oh,
I
history stories.
kind of write, I'm writing history because a couple of reasons. One, these are stories that I didn't know about when I was young, and I find them incredibly fascinating. I feel like I didn't get, when I was growing up, the way history was taught was that they would just teach you dates and a lot about wars and things like that and battles. And I thought I didn't like it. But really, what I love is that history, the stories of people and how people lived during a certain time period. I love the stories of how people lived differently or how they lived the same, like how not much has changed. But I also think it's important um, to tell kids the truth about what really happened in the history of this country so that we have a better understanding of how everyone made this country what it is.
Absolutely. Um, so Lisa, I wanted to ask you because I feel like you are maybe a good person that has seen this. We are in the middle of Banned Books Week. Those of you who don't know what that's about, the American Library Association plans out this week just to make people aware of books that they think are really important and that sometimes other people don't want us to read because they could be scary. They could talk about things that they're not comfortable with. Like Lesa, what's one of your, I saw your picture of your mom. She was reading Toni Morrison, and we know that Toni Morrison has been on the banned book list before. What's your thought about why people still ban books or try to?
I'll be honest with you. I find the ban book, people who are interested in banning books, so confusing. Um, we have to trust that we should want our children to be better and to know more and to develop empathy. And the ways in which you develop empathy and understanding of other people and other cultures and even yourself is, I think, often through reading and through the characters in books. What I loved about my mother is that she used to take me to the library and I could pick out any book that I wanted, any book. And what I trust about children is that if it's a book that is too much for them, they'll stop reading. Um, if it's a book that they're not interested in, they'll stop reading. But generally, I think kids are the most open individuals and that they're interested in learning and understanding people from all over this country. And so I think we're just doing them such a disservice by not allowing them to read whatever they want to read. And what I recognize in doing research in history is that when people are trying to prevent you from doing things like reading books about other people, other cultures, it's generally some sense of fear. It's rooted in fear. And so what they are fearful of is maybe, kids will be too open, too understanding. But what I know is there's nothing more important than opening a book and reading anything and everything you get your hands on.
Yeah. Do you have some books that you recommend our readers check out when they're done with Finding Langston? Of course, they should read the rest of your books in this series. But are there some books either from your childhood or that are out currently that you think are just really important for kids to read?
Oh, I think anything by Renee Watson is a good pick. I
Mm-hmm.
think anything by Carol Boston Weatherford is a great pick. Kyle Lukoff is an incredible writer. There are so many great writers, and I'm always forgetting titles even though all the books are in back of me. Probably half of my library is filled with banned books, but I think Carol Boston Weatherford, Renee Watson, Kyle Lukoff. You can't go wrong with any of those authors.
Well, thank you, because at least one of those names is not one I'm familiar with. So I absolutely love learning that there are books that we all should be reading, not just when you're in school. I love reading middle grade. Um, so if we don't have any more questions, we can kind of wrap up a little bit early. I just want to say thank you again so much. I really hope everyone has a great time reading this book and that it helps you go out and find out stories about other historical figures and people that you aren't familiar with, because history and people who write their memoir, it's very, very cool to find out what other people have done with this one life that we're given.
That's right. It's so true.
Yeah.
Thank you
So
also.
yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. So everybody just have a great time reading. If you're local to us, come in and say hi at Roundabout. If you're not, make sure you're visiting your independent bookstore so that they can keep you having all the books that you want. Oh, did we have one more question? Misha, you've got your hand raised. Go for it. This will be our last one.
If you wanted an autograph from the author, how could you get one?
Oh, Lesa, do you do book plates ever?
Yeah, I sure do. Yeah. I
Okay.
can send the book plate and you can put it in your book.
Yeah. Misha, are you here local to us or are you in Portland?
Portland.
Portland. Um, you can always, Lesa, you have a contact form on your website, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so you can have your parents help you. You can send an email to the author to see if you can get a book plate. Yeah, so just get in touch with the author. I wish we could order signed copies every single time. I love collecting signed books. It's so nice, but sometimes that's not feasible. So we will do our best. All right, so one last time, everybody say thank you to Lesa Cline-Ransome for talking about finding Langston.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Wow.
Thank you so much. If you're joining us for our next one for Rebecca Steed for the Lost Library, I'm going to go up and open that Zoom room too. We've got a busy night, and I will see all of you guys next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.